doing, I think I'm going to title this DVD, The History of Palmyra, wait, your collar's up. The History of Palmyra as told by the people who lived there. Okay, so these are the stories of Palmyra. It's the stories of Palmyra as told by the people who lived there. So what I'm going to do is say, tell us your name and how you got to Palmyra, whether you were born here or you came to Palmyra, and then start telling your story. Now you need to speak up because of that beeping and because of the distance of the tape, okay? So go ahead, say your name loud and clear, and then we can start.
My name is Charles A. Reed, better known as Charlie Reed, and I came to Palmyra in 1955 to teach school at the Palmyra High School.
Okay, all right, and did you grow up in the general area, or what drew you to Palmyra?
I'm from York County.
From York County?
Yeah, both the city and south of the York County, the city near the Maryland state line.
Okay, but what drew you to Palmyra at the time? Just because there was a job there?
Well, I had attended Lebanon Valley College, and I graduated in 1954, and I decided I was going to obtain a teaching job in Lebanon County, and Palmyra was available in 55.
Okay. And who was in the school system? Who were some of the people that we would recognize their names in 55?
Well, Robert Hartz was they called him supervising principal at that time. He would be superintendent today. And he was a very notable figure because he was a veteran of World War I who had served in the squadron commanded by Eddie Rickenbacker. And he also was an extreme activist in doing positive things in the community. And the other person I would mention is Rule Swank, better known as Buck, who was connected with the school system for 40-some years. And particularly, he was notable in the area of athletics because Palmyra athletics were prominent, mainly because of Buck Swank.
And of course, they named the stadium after him.
The stadium after him, right.
Okay, great, very good, excellent. Okay, so you taught history?
I taught what was called Problems of Democracy at that time. It was a study of government, and I taught American history.
Okay. And how long did you teach? How long were you involved with the school system?
Well, I actually taught from 55 to 70, and then from 70 to 88, when I retired, I held different administrative jobs. The most notable was I was a superintendent's assistant for academic affairs for a considerable number of years.
What changes did you see in the school system in that time in Palmyra, from 55 to 70? Let's go that distance.
You mean
first.
55 to 88, like,
well,
for example?
I was going to go the first part first, but that's okay. What changes did you see?
The population in the 50s and the 60s was much different than it is today. Most people had never graduated from high school. Many of the parents had never attended high school. They wanted their children to graduate from high school. However, when it came to helping them with their studies, most of them couldn't do it. And I think the parents' main role at that time was they said to the children, you're going to school and we want you to act appropriately. And the parents enforced that. Whereas, as you know today, we live in a highly educated area. And the parents, in many cases, can assist the students in almost any subject.
Interesting commentary on what has happened with the whole area in Lebanon County. Okay, so you were a school teacher, then an administrator, then you retired, and then you started a new profession.
Yes, I retired because I intended to write books.
Okay. Tell us about some of the books that you've written, because I think they deal with the history of Palmyra.
Yes, now the first book, as I told you earlier, that I wrote was a hardback book, a hardcover book, and I wanted to write a biography of someone in Lebanon County. And I decided the individual was Dr. Frederick K. Miller, who had been president of Lebanon Valley College and is an extremely notable person. Both he and his father, who was a minister in the history of Lebanon County. It's very formally written, and I followed all the rules of grammar and academic writing in writing that
Did
book.
you interview him for this, or did you go by
Oh, he
other
was
historical?
dead.
Oh, he was dead at the time you
He
wrote
was
it.
dead
Wow.
more than 20 years when I wrote it. But I did interview and talk extensively to his wife, who was living.
Okay.
Now, I've written 9 additional books, and they're, of course, paper cover books, and all of those deal with Palmyra.
Well, tell us some of the stories that you highlight in your books.
Well, this is in the order that I've written them by
Okay.
era. The first book was Charlie's Story, The People I've Known, and it was really an extremely popular book. I do not like to reprint books, but this one I've reprinted twice. I've never reprinted any of the other ones, but at that time that I wrote that, it's about people who lived in Palmyra in the 50s and 60s and 40s and 30s. And many of the people were living in it at that time.
At the time.
And I tried to fit it into the story of the community. And I must say, in the sales, it was very successful.
Well, can you share some of that with us? Or-
Well,
because that's really what we're trying to do here, is tell the story.
What I did was, I took individuals and around the town,
Mhm.
like your dad, for example.
Okay.
I don't know if he was the mayor at the time.
In the 70s. He
Oh,
was
was
mayor
he
in the 70s,
70s?
yes.
Well,
And this is Sam Baumgartner, for people
yes,
who may not know.
Sam
My
Baumgartner.
father.
Well, this book I published in 1994.
Okay.
And many of the people that I have in here, well, Jack Seltzer, for example.
Who was a state representative.
Jack's in here, and Bob Hartz, and Buck Swank, and our former mayor, Watts. I have information in here about him, and the Wagners. You remember the Wagner
Wagners.
Automobile
Right,
Company?
Light Wagner. and-
Yes, he's an individual that's in here, and many of the people that were storekeepers,
Okay.
that they had stores on East and West Main. I've included them. And now I didn't write extensively about them because I wanted to keep the book to the number of pages. I try never in these books to exceed 130 pages, and so I can keep the price down. And
Is that still for sale?
No,
Oh.
none of my books are for
Okay.
sale. I've been fortunate in that I've sold all of them.
So if anyone has that, this is a real keeper. I mean, it's a real treasure.
Yes, it really is.
That's great.
Now, this is the second book I wrote about Palmyra, and it's called The American House Murder, a Palmyra Tragedy. And it was a murder that occurred in 1901 on this same side of the street. If you go west, sort of across from Funk's, maybe
Okay.
diagonally across from Funk's. There's a stone house today that's trimmed in green.
I'll have to look for that.
There was a hotel there for a number of years. And there was a brutal murder committed on a local man by a German immigrant that had been living out at the quarry. And it really is a story because it's too lengthy and too complicated for me to try to summarize it. But
Now, how did you get the information? Did you interview people that
yes,
knew of this?
I interviewed people who were old enough that they heard the story from their fathers and grandfathers. And also the newspapers, Harrisburg, Lancaster, Lebanon. And it was something that lasted a long time because this occurred in the fall of 1901, and the local constable was still almost 6 months later, giving most of his time going around searching, because people would say, I think we saw the German, because they called the killer a German. And it lasted a long time.
So he was not found for a long time?
He was never found.
He was never found?
Never found, but a lot of stories, because people, it so devastated Palmyra that they wanted a finality to the story. And all kinds of stories developed in which maybe it was in some other locale. And somebody would come back with a story, oh, I know the German was killed in a bar room, and then they would tell that story. Now, it's believed today that most of those stories, though all of those stories were not true, that probably he got in a train and was long gone.
Wow.
But
Little Palmyra.
what's that?
I said Little Palmyra,
Yes.
which was very little in 1901. I mean,
Yeah.
there was just about a main street, and that was about it.
That was about it. And this book was Dr. John Palm, Palmyra's first citizen, and I think most people know about John Palm, and he's an extremely admirable and historic person.
Well, I remember when you told the story, I knew the name, but I didn't know much about Dr. Palm. And when we had the John Palm reunion as part of the 250th, I remember you saying to his family members, he was quite the visionary.
He was.
And that gave me a good perspective on it.
That, of course, now I remember he was a well-educated man, but he was a visionary. And he was a visionary in Germany. He didn't stay in one place. He didn't like where he lived with his parents, so he went to another place because he had a vision of doing something, and he became a physician. And his vision then was to come to the United States. And of course he settled in New Jersey. It was called New York then. And he was unhappy after being there more than a decade. And then he came in a slow trip. He settled briefly at a few places in Berks County and worked his way up here. And there was a small settlement by the creek at that time. And he decided to settle there and then bought the land eventually where Palmyra is located. And it was called Palmstown.
Palmstown when he started. Now, who did he buy the land from? He didn't buy it from the Penns, did he?
No. He bought it. I can't recall the person. I have it in the book, the person he bought it from, but I can't recall. Now, another book, and this is really a great story. The Old Livery Stable. From horse stable to garage to nightclub to inferno. You see, 4 things occurred here.
And you know, a lot of people are curious about the livery stable and what happened.
Well, over in the neighborhood of where the pizza is located now, it was a livery stable for many, many years, going back to colonial times, and a very successful livery stable. And then Russ Gingrich, when the having horses and items for people that traveled that way at that time played out. In the 1930s, the early 1930s, he established his first garage over there in the same building, the old livery stable. And of course, you know, eventually he located down where Cliff Lewis is located today. But he had a garage there. But he decided to expand, and that wasn't suitable. So he sold it, and it was purchased and made into a nightclub. And you can see it in the 1935 celebration book. And it was truly a wonder inside. Now, it was not nearly as magnificent outside as it was inside, but it was a nightclub that lasted somewhere between a year and 2 years. Now, being right behind the Lutheran church, it ran into difficulty. And as a result, the local churches decided they wanted to put it out of business. So in the election of 1935, they put in the ballot that hard liquor could no longer be sold in Palmyra.
Okay, so that's when that started, because when I was growing up, there was no hard liquor.
Yeah, okay. It passed by 35 votes. That's
How close it was.
that's
But up till that time, they did have the sale of
They
liquor
had
in Palmyra.
liquor,
That's why that
And
started.
of course, we know that it was only beer until the recent years with hard liquor sales. And then the nightclub closed, and they had different businesses in there over the years. And eventually, you remember, it became a small apartment house. And that's where the Inferno part is. You remember when they
I
went-
wasn't here, but I understand there's a huge
There was
fire.
a huge fire, 4 people were killed. And the irony of it is that the 18-year-old girl that set the fire, she just put it in, I guess, in a bucket in a closet, because a part-time policeman that had sort of been courting her around at times, but wasn't really serious about her, but she was about him. And she thought, well, if I start a little fire, he's also a part-time fireman and he'll come.
I didn't realize all that.
And you know what happened, it got out of hand, 4 people were killed, and she went to prison for 10 years.
Yeah, because I didn't live in the area then, I didn't know all of it. People talk about the fire all the time. So
It was.
thank you for bringing us up to date from the early stages of that liquor store. That's neat. What else do you have here? These are the stories of Palmyra.
This is the role of women in the development of Palmyra. And what I did is showed how the women developed and what their role was. If you really read the early history, you don't really realize how important women were, because they were. And I explain the real role that the women played, and then I get into the period after 1900 when women became more active in the churches, the schools, and the communities, and I
Do you-
explained that.
I didn't realize you did that. That sounds very interesting. Are there specific women that are mentioned in there? Or
Oh, yes, yes, there are.
like who?
Many of them are mentioned. I can't recall who the people in the earlier years were.
Okay.
Because I've written it so long ago.
But now, where did you find out that information about these early women?
Oh, well, I went into all books and sources and businesses and journals to get their names. And one place you go to is you go to the churches and you get their old booklets, because the churches is probably the first place outside of the home. Now, I start with the home and show the influence of the women in the home is much greater than outwardly when you see everything is controlled by men. And I started with the churches and the schools, and I just came up with bundles of information.
Now, what What gave you the idea to do that? I think that's
I'll
fascinating.
tell you.
Okay, all right, all right.
Now, my next book was the story of Palmyra, John Paul to John Travolta. And it's really a brief history of Palmyra, but it's extremely brief. And it goes up to the time that John Travolta was here.
Well, tell us about that, because no one's talked about that. And yet for a year, we had a poster hanging in here of the movie that he was here for.
Well, I was fortunate in that I was able to meet John Travolta. They had policemen around saying you can't go anywhere. And I went in Lauk's back door at that time, and I came in. And the reason they didn't want anyone in there is John Travolta, between the scenes, was standing in there. And I went up and I said, "I'm Charlie Reed, Mr. Travolta," and he shook my hand, and he was just as gracious as could be. Gave me an autograph, and we talked briefly. And there's always been questions about him, his religion.
Mm-hmm.
And I decided, when I leave, I'm going to say, "God bless you, Mr. Travolta," which I did. And he very quickly said, "And God bless you," which sort of surprised me, because I now feel maybe he's not as negative about religion as some of the writers make him.
Uh-huh.
But I have that brief story, and the reason I brought John Travolta in it, just as I was ending. In fact, I stretched it out. I was going to produce it earlier, but I stretched it out so that I could bring that story.
Well, it's a clever title, too, from John Paul to John Travolta.
Now, Men Who Made Palmyra. Now, you asked about the women's book. I decided if I come out with a book, Men Who Made Palmyra, there are women, legions of them, are going to come to me and say, "Charlie, where are the women? We're getting tired of everybody emphasizing men." So I decided I was writing about women first.
Great idea, very political.
And then essentially, it's the great and historic men of Palmyra. Now this one, I decided I had to write something about the people who have written about Palmyra, you know. And you know who they are from being in here. Seeing all the celebration books. We now have 5 of them. And I thought, well, I have to mention, like Israel
Early, that's right.
People like that. And of course, it was a delight, because I went into their background and their writing and what they wrote about and so on. And I was able to put it into print.
Now, I have a question. When you were writing about Israel Early, is his wife, Myra, in the women's book? She was a very influential person in my life, personally.
Well, let me tell you this. Of all the people I single out in that book as being influential over a period of time for the future, she holds first place.
Well, I can believe that, because my mother, she was my mother's Girl Scout leader, and my mother talked about her as I was growing up, and then I had the honor of, being in her presence and being one of her.
I certainly
proteges.
did, because she really broke ground,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of it was Girl Scouts.
Mm-hmm.
That's the vehicle that she used.
That's right.
And now the last book that I wrote, well, actually this is a reprinting, you might say. Over the years, people have said, "Charlie, will you reprint The American House Murder? Will you reprint The Old Livery Stable?" And I say, no. But then finally I decided, well, what I'm going to do is take those 2 stories and put them into one book. And what I've done is summarized, so to speak. It's not as lengthy as the original books. But I must say, I was very successful in the number that I sold. And the people really have been happy about this, because even though they weren't able to get the lengthy version, they have the shorter versions, because in all honesty, they're the two most popular stories
Well,
that I came up with.
they're the ones that, as people came in here all year long to the headquarters, they would ask questions about those stories.
Now, all of my books are stories. I don't claim to be an historian, you know. I'm a writer, and I know history, but not as a historian. So I created this character that I call the Dutchman, and that's really me. He tells the stories for me. And the only book that I don't use him in is the first one, Charlie's.
Right. Well, that's why we wanted to ask you to tell some stories of Palmyra for this videotape. That's why. Are these? You said they're out of print and so forth. Is there a whole set in the Palmyra Library? Can someone read all of them?
Well, let's put it this way. One copy, at least one copy was given. But the way the library system works today, that somebody in another locale might say, will you send me that? And they send it. I don't know whether they get them all back.
Oh, boy, that would be a shame if they aren't.
Now, the one place that I have all of them is the Historical Society.
Oh, they do have a complete set there.
Yeah,
Okay.
I thought, well, that's the one place I can have certainty that there is a complete set. Because the way the local libraries operate today, you can't be sure.
You're right. You're right. So the Historical Society in Lebanon has that, and anyone can go in there and do research so that they could go in there and see them. But I don't know that they let them out. I'm not sure.
I don't know either. I don't think they're really a circulation library.
No, I don't think so either. I think it's more
As
for
much as
research. Right. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate that you're willing to tell your story about Palmyra as well as the stories that you have chronicled in your book. So we appreciate you being here. Thanks again.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Now, was that hard? That was perfect. That